Close your eyes. Let the day go. Whatever it brought you, whatever you carried through it, set it down now beside you like a coat you no longer need, and let your body find the particular heaviness of rest. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing waiting for you on the other side of this night that cannot wait until morning. What we are going to explore together belongs to an age so distant from this one that the very mountains have changed their shapes since it occurred, and the seas have swallowed coastlines that once had names. And the people who witnessed these events are so far beyond the reach of memory that they exist now only in the older stories, the ones that feel less like history and more like dreams you almost remember. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders drop. We're going somewhere very old and very deep tonight, to the moment before the moment that changed everything, to the fire at the centre of the world where a single object was made that would spend the next several ages of the world looking for the one it was made for. The fires of Mount Doom burned before men came to Middle-earth in the numbers they would later come. The mountain itself was not simply a volcano in the geological sense, though it was also that, a great cone of rock thrusting up from the ashen plain of Mordor with rivers of fire running down its flanks in the long ages when the Dark Lord kept it active to serve his purposes. It was something more deliberate than geology. It was a forge. The greatest forge in the world, maintained by a will that understood fire as an instrument rather than merely a force, that had been working with heat and craft and the specific magic of making for so many thousands of years that the distinction between the mountain's natural fire and the Dark Lord's shaped fire had long ceased to be meaningful. The heat that rose from its summit was not indifferent. It had intention behind it. It remembered what had been made in it and what making required. Sauron had been a craftsman before he was a tyrant. This is the fact about him that gets lost most easily in the long account of his wars and his dominions, the truth beneath the shadow that makes the shadow comprehensible. He had been, in the deep ages before his corruption was complete, among the most gifted of the Maya in the art of making things. His original name, Mehron, meant the admirable, and the admiration was genuine, earned through a skill with craft and order, and the shaping of matter into purposeful form that was recognized even among the Valar. He loved order, he loved precision, he loved the satisfaction of a thing perfectly made, a mechanism that did exactly what it was designed to do, without waste or imprecision or the untidy excess of natural process. This love of craft was not evil in itself. It was in fact beautiful, the way any genuine mastery is beautiful. What corrupted it was the turn toward domination, the moment when the desire to make things perfectly shaded into the desire to make things obedient, when the craftsman's satisfaction became the tyrant's appetite. The rings of power were his masterwork, and they were made in the tradition of the elvish smiths of a region rather than against it. Celebrimbor and his guild had been creating rings of power for their own purposes, rings that captured and preserved and enhanced the beauty of the living world, rings that slowed the natural processes of decay in the realms where they were worn. Sauron, calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, had spent decades among the elven smiths of Eregion, teaching and sharing and subtly shaping their craft toward his own ends. The 19 rings made in that long collaboration were genuine in their beauty and genuine in their power. What Sauron added, without the knowledge of those who made them beside him, was a dependency, a structure within each ring that connected it, invisibly, to the one ring he was already planning. The 19 were made with Celebrimbor's full art. They were beautiful. That beauty was the trap. He went to Orodruin to make that one ring in secret. The smiths of Eregion were not present. The elves who had trusted him and learned from him, and in some cases perhaps thought of him as something approaching a friend, were not there. He was alone in the mountain with his purpose and his craft and the fire that responded to his will. And in that aloneness he did the thing that made the 19 rings dangerous, that turned the beautiful work of Celebrimbor and his guild into instruments of potential enslavement. He poured into the one ring a portion of his own power and his own will, more of himself than any being had ever placed into a crafted object, a concentration of identity and purpose so intense that the ring was not simply an artifact. It was, in a very real sense, him. Or rather, it was the part of him he was willing to give to the world in permanent form, the essence of his dominating will made physical and portable and indestructible. He spoke words as he made it. The forging was not silent. The words are preserved, in the common tongue translation that will echo through all the ages that follow as the verse every reader of this history knows. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness, bind them. These words were not poetry in the decorative sense. They were a description of function, a technical specification spoken aloud by the craftsman who understood exactly what the object in his hand was designed to accomplish. The ring would rule, the ring would find, the ring would bind, and the fire of Orodruin, obedient to his will as it had been for ages, hardened the gold around those three purposes and made them permanent. It is worth pausing here, in the warmth of wherever you are resting, to let the weight of that act settle. Sauron placed a portion of himself into the ring, which meant that his fate and the ring's fate became intertwined in a way he may not have fully calculated in the moment of making. A craftsman who pours too much of himself into his work discovers that the work can hurt him in ways that ordinary objects cannot. The ring was indestructible by ordinary means, but it was not invulnerable. It was vulnerable to exactly the thing that made it powerful, which was the concentrated personal essence it contained. If the ring were destroyed, that concentrated essence would be unmade with it. Sauron had made himself stronger by making the ring, and he had made himself more fragile at the same time. This is the great craftsman's dilemma, the paradox at the centre of every act of creation that gives too much. The thing you pour yourself into becomes the thing that has power over you. The elves felt the ring the moment it was completed. Celebrimbor and the smiths of Eregion had been working with rings long enough to feel the shift in the fabric of what they had made. The sudden awareness that their beautiful instruments of preservation had been connected, without their consent, to something vast and dark and controlling. They took off their three greatest rings at once, the three that Sauron had not touched directly, and hid them. The war that followed the revelation of Sauron's betrayal consumed a region entirely. Celebrimbor died defending the works of his guild. The land was laid waste, but the three rings were hidden, and the one ring, for all its terrible power, could not compel those who had never worn it, and the three greatest works of the elvish smiths passed out of Sauron's reach. The One Ring went with its maker into the wars of the Second Age, and its history in those wars belongs to later movements in our journey tonight. What matters here, at the beginning, is the ring as an object. A plain band of gold, unadorned, unremarkable in appearance except for the fire letters that appeared on its surface when heated, the black speech inscription that described its function. In the cold light of any ordinary day, it was nothing. A ring, small enough to fit on a finger, light enough to be forgotten in a pocket, unassuming in the way that things of the greatest importance are often unassuming, as if their significance is held inside them rather than displayed on their surface. You could set it on a table and walk past it without a second glance. You could hold it in your palm and feel only the warmth that it produced, that particular warmth that gold does not ordinarily produce, and not yet understand what that warmth was telling you. Frodo Baggins would hold it in his palm one September evening in the Shire, and feel its weight, and find it heavier than its size suggested. Sam Gamgee, looking on from the doorway, would feel something he couldn't name, a sense of presence in the room that didn't belong to either of them. Bilbo Baggins, finding it in a dark tunnel beneath a mountain decades before either of them were born, would pick it up from the cold stone floor and slip it into his pocket without understanding what he had found, with only the vague sense that his luck had turned in a direction he couldn't quite read yet. But the ring understood. The ring always understood. It had been looking, in its patient and purposeful way, for the path that would return it to its maker, and every hand it passed through and every pocket it rested in was evaluated, assessed, measured against the ring's own inexhaustible patience and its single, unwavering intention. The craftsman made a thing that was more than a thing. That is the beginning of all the trouble, and also the beginning of the story's strange beauty. Because a thing that is more than a thing has consequences that a thing does not have, consequences that run forward through time in directions the maker could not have predicted, and through hands the maker never intended. The ring was made to dominate. What it accomplished across the long ages of its existence was to reveal the nature of everyone who encountered it. In every hand it passed through, from Isildur to Gollum to Bilbo to Frodo, the ring held up a mirror. What each person saw in that mirror was themselves under the fullest possible pressure, themselves at the limit of their desire and their fear and their love. Some mirrors are made of gold rather than silver. They still show you what you are. Let that image settle you now, the ring warm in a pocket, patient as the mountain above it. The dark around it complete, and somewhere above, moving through the years with the slow certainty of someone who does not know they are being found. Something small and warm and entirely unaware of what is coming toward it from the other direction. The moment of encounter is still ahead. Rest in the warmth. The fire that made the ring is far away and long ago, and the warmth around you tonight is an entirely different kind, the kind that asks nothing of you, the kind that simply holds you while you rest. The plain surface of the ring conceals something that all the great rings of power share, which is the encoded intention of the maker. Celebrimbor made rings that slowed decay, that preserved the beauty of the living world in the realms where they were worn. His rings were made from love of what existed, from the elvish grief at the passing of beautiful things. Sauron made his ring from the opposite impulse, from the desire to arrest the will of others, to turn the living world from a thing that existed freely into a thing that existed in service. The same craft, applied to opposite ends, produces objects that look similar and work in entirely different ways. This is the deepest lesson of the rings of power. The intention of the maker is not decoration. It is the bone structure of the made thing, invisible from outside but present in every function, every use, every effect on the world. The fires of Orodruin remember what was made in them. This is not metaphor. The mountain is, in some sense that the oldest law of Middle-earth touches without fully explaining, aware of what it contains. The crack of doom is not merely a volcanic vent. It is the specific fire that has the specific relationship with the specific object that was made in it, and that relationship is the reason no other fire will do, the reason the ring cannot be unmade in a dragon's flame or a forgemaster's furnace or any of the other intense fires the world contains. Made in one fire, unmade in that same fire. The symmetry is not poetic convention. It is the structure of a law that governs what making means when what is made is as intentional as the One Ring. There is a moment in the history of Middle-earth that everything else turns on, and it is not the moment Bilbo found the ring. It is not the moment Frodo carried it to the crack of doom. It is a moment that happened centuries before either of them were born, on the slopes of a mountain in Mordor, in the aftermath of a war that had cost the world almost more than it could pay. A moment in which one man stood with the greatest object of power in the world balanced in his palm and chose wrongly. The wrong choice was entirely understandable. It was the choice that any grieving, exhausted, justifiably proud person might have made in the same circumstances. It was wrong in the specific way that many of the worst wrong choices are wrong, not through malice or stupidity, but through a very human failure to see clearly in the moment when clarity was most required. That moment is where we go now, moving backward through the centuries before we move forward again toward Bilbo, because the path to the hobbit hole runs through the ruin of an army and the death of a king. Let your body be heavy. Let the pillow or the cushion or whatever holds you tonight be noticed beneath you, solid and warm and entirely present. We are going to watch something happen that cannot be undone, and watching things that cannot be undone is easier when the body is settled and the breath is slow. There is no urgency here. The past is already complete. We are only visiting it. The War of the Last Alliance brought together the greatest force that had been assembled in the world since the wars of the First Age. Gil-galad, the last elven High King of Middle-earth, stood with Elendil, the High King of the Men of the West, and between them they gathered an army that crossed into Mordor after a siege of 7 years and broke through to the very plateau of the Dark Lord's stronghold. The siege itself is difficult to hold in the imagination without losing its scale. 7 years of encampment around the Black Towers of Barad-dûr, 7 years of maintaining the pressure of an alliance between peoples of very different natures and very different relationships to time. For the elves, 7 years was not extraordinary as a duration. For the men, 7 years was the better part of a decade, an enormous investment of lives and resources, and the particular human patience that has to be renewed, and renewed because it does not come naturally the way it comes to those who do not age. The camp outside Mordor would have been a city in itself by the 7th year, a temporary settlement of many thousands of soldiers and their support, with the fires of the besieging army visible from the towers of Barad-dûr and the towers of Barad-dûr visible from the camp. The quality of those 7 years is almost unimaginable in its combination of tedium and dread. Sieges are the slowest form of war. They are the form of war where the waiting is the weapon, where patience is the sharpest instrument available, and where the soldiers doing the waiting must maintain, across years rather than days, the conviction that the waiting is worth it. Elendil and Gil-galad maintained that conviction through the force of their characters and the seriousness of the alliance they embodied, and the understanding shared by everyone present who had thought carefully about what they were fighting, that the alternative to maintaining the siege was an age of Sauron's dominion that none of them, and none of their descendants, would live to see the end of. Sauron came forth at the end of the siege to meet the leaders of the alliance in single combat, which was an act of terrible power rather than of chivalry. He was enormous in his chosen form in those days, a figure of shadow and fire, wearing the One Ring openly on his hand, channeling through it the full concentration of his will and power. Gil-galad died in that encounter. Elendil died. Anarion, Elendil's son, had already fallen in the siege. The losses at the summit of that last battle were devastating. The great and the irreplaceable going out of the world in the same moments that victory was being achieved. It was Isildur, Elendil's surviving son, who took up his father's broken sword and used the shard of it to cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand. Sauron was diminished in that moment to something that could not maintain a physical form. His spirit fled. His armies collapsed without the ring's animating will behind them. The war was won. The Great Alliance had accomplished what it set out to accomplish, and Isildur stood on the mountain with the ring in his hand, and the shards of his father's sword at his feet, and his brother and his father dead within the hour, and the ring was warm against his palm in a way that gold does not normally warm. He looked at it, and the grief of the day was in him, and the exhaustion of 7 years was in him, and the pride of having been the one to end it was in him, and the ring, which had been looking for exactly this combination of grief and pride and exhaustion, found them all and made them work together in the direction it required. Elrond was there. He told Isildur to cast it into the fire. The crack of doom was nearby, the same fire that had made the ring, the only fire in the world hot enough to unmake it. The path to the crack was short. The ring could have ended there, on the day of its maker's defeat. The history of the next 3,000 years could have been different entirely. Isildur looked at the ring and felt something that he described afterward, in the brief account preserved in the archives of Minas Tirith, as a burning desire to keep it, and a certainty that he deserved it. Wergild, he called it, the compensation owed to him for the deaths of his father and his brother. He kept it. He walked away from the fire with it in his hand, and the ring was accomplishing exactly what it had always been designed to accomplish. It is worth pausing here to feel the full weight of that single decision, not to judge Isildur, who was a person carrying grief and pride simultaneously in a moment of enormous exhaustion, but to understand what the ring did with those entirely human qualities. It found them. It amplified them. It made the grief into a justification, and the pride into a certainty, and the exhaustion into an argument against the additional effort of walking to the fire. This is the ring's method. It does not introduce anything foreign into the person who holds it. It finds what is already there and makes it larger, makes it louder, makes it feel like the most important and most obvious thing in the world until the alternative disappears. Isildur did not feel himself being manipulated. He felt himself arriving at a perfectly reasonable conclusion that happened to align with keeping the ring. Isildur did not live long enough to be destroyed by it. 2 years after the fall of Sauron, while travelling through the Gladden Fields on the return north, his party was ambushed by orcs. He put on the ring to escape in the river, and the ring which had clung so insistently to its wearer, which had bent his will toward keeping it, simply slipped from his finger in the current. Not lost by accident, not taken by force, slipped free, as if the ring had decided that this particular hand had served its purpose, had failed to return it to Sauron, had lived out its usefulness, and the ring needed to move on toward another arrangement. The river received it and the riverbed held it, and the centuries began. The ring lay in the Gladden Fields for almost 2,000 years. This is a span of time that resists ordinary imagination. Kingdoms rose and fell above it. The world of men changed shape multiple times over. The great alliance that had defeated Sauron became the history of the Second Age, and then the legend of the Second Age, and then the fading, imprecise legend that by the Third Age's middle centuries only the longest-lived and most scholarly of beings could cite with any accuracy. The ring lay in the mud and did not age and did not change and did not stop being what it was. The fire that made it was still burning in the mountain to the south and east. The maker who had put himself into it was still present in the world, diminished but not destroyed, slowly gathering himself again in the shadow of Dol Guldur, waiting with the patience of something that had not died and could not die as long as the ring existed. Let the river carry you now. Let the current be gentle and slow, and the water cold and clear above the riverbed. The ring is down there in the dark, patient as stone, patient as the fire that made it. The centuries are passing above it like clouds passing above a mountain. Somewhere, far in the future, something small and warm is going to come along this river's edge, in a tunnel under a mountain where a pale creature rose silently on an underground lake. That moment is coming, but not yet. For now the ring rests in the water, and you rest in the warmth, and the night is quiet and complete. The 7 years of the last Alliance's siege produced in its survivors a quality of relationship with endurance that the comfortable centuries before the siege had not required. These were people who had lived through something that should not have been livable, and had survived it not through luck, but through the sustained exercise of every quality they possessed, their courage and their discipline and their commitment to an alliance that would have been easier to abandon than to maintain. When Isildur stood at the crack of doom at the end of that siege with the ring in his hand, he was a man who had spent 7 years watching people die in a cause he believed in, who had lost his brother in that cause, who had now lost his father in its final moments. He was not the same person who had crossed into Mordor 7 years before. He was a person whose entire frame of reference had been forged in the particular crucible of a very long war. The ring found exactly that person at exactly that moment. Elrond remembered. He carried the memory of the moment at the crack of doom for 3,000 years. The specific quality of standing beside Isildur and speaking the words that needed to be spoken, and watching those words fail to accomplish what they needed to accomplish. He remembered it not as a failure of his own persuasion, but as a demonstration of what the ring could do to a person's capacity for clear choice in a moment of maximum vulnerability. When he sat at the council in Rivendell 3 millennia later and looked around at the gathered representatives of the Free Peoples, and spoke his assessment of the situation, everything he said was informed by that one memory. He had been there when the ring could have been ended and was not. The weight of 3,000 years of consequences lived in his voice when he spoke of it. There is something that the account of the last Alliance's ending does not dwell on, but that Tolkien's broader history touches, which is the grief of the victory. The armies that marched home from Mordor were not the armies that had marched into it. They had been diminished by 7 years in ways that went beyond the count of the fallen. The men who survived carried a specific weight that only people who have been in the presence of evil for a prolonged period carry, the weight of having known what the world can be at its worst, and of needing to reconstitute, from whatever remained of themselves, the capacity to engage with the world at its ordinary level again. Gil-galad was gone, Elendil was gone, Anarion was gone. The great names that had organised the Alliance and given it its shape were absent from the return, and the men who came home were men who had outlived their leaders and now had to figure out what leadership looked like without them. 500 years is a long time to be alone. It is a long time to be anything, but alone in the dark below a mountain, with only a ring and a lake and the fish that occasionally came within reach, 500 years is so long that the person who went into that darkness is not recognisable in the creature that emerged from it. Not in any simple sense of transformation, but in the specific, irreversible way that extremely long durations change things, the way that a stone changes a river not by dramatic event, but by the continuous slow pressure of being there, of being present for every current, of accumulating the effects of every season until the riverbed is shaped around the stone in a way that the stone and the river have made together without either of them intending it. Gollum and the ring made each other over 500 years. The ring made Gollum more of what he had always been, stripped away everything that was not the consuming desire at his centre, and Gollum made the ring a hiding thing, a secret thing, a treasure in the dark rather than a weapon in the light. They were companions in the way that a prisoner and their cell become companions across sufficient time. Let your breathing slow now, in through the nose and out. The darkness of wherever your eyes are closed is warm and familiar and entirely yours. The darkness we are moving through tonight is different in quality, older and colder, and much more complete. The darkness beneath a mountain where light has never reached except by intention, where the only sounds are water and stone and the small sounds a solitary creature makes when it is alone enough to stop pretending it is not talking to itself. There is something restful about other people's darkness. You can observe it from the warmth of your own light and let it pass through you without catching. Sméagol was his name before the ring changed it. A store hobbit, one of the river folk who lived along the banks of the Anduin in the days when the Shire was not yet settled, before the hobbits had made their long migration west. He was not remarkable among his people, not wise or powerful, or destined by any evident characteristic for a significant role in history. He was, from what the accounts preserve, a somewhat acquisitive creature even before the ring, fond of digging and finding and keeping, possessed of a family member named Sméagol, who was his closest companion, who found the ring in the river on his birthday while they were fishing together. Sméagol saw the ring in the current and reached for it because it was beautiful, and because things that gleam in river water invite reaching for, which is one of the most fundamental human instincts, and one that the ring had no difficulty exploiting. He pulled it from the water and held it in his palm, and it was warm against his skin, in the way that gold does not ordinarily warm, and it was his birthday, and he thought quite naturally that a birthday find as fine as this one might reasonably be kept. Sméagol saw it and wanted it immediately, with a clarity of desire that surprised him, even as he felt it. He asked for it as a birthday present. Sméagol refused. The argument that followed was brief, and its ending was something that Sméagol, who had never harmed anyone before that afternoon, would spend the rest of his very long life both remembering and refusing to remember in the specific way that the worst things we do are both unforgettable and constantly denied. He took the ring. He was driven out by his family and his community, who did not know precisely what had happened but knew enough to know that something was wrong with him, that the person who had been Sméagol had been replaced by something that watched from under heavy brows and muttered to itself, and flinched from sunlight and called everything his and precious, in a tone that made the ordinary word sound like a wound. He went to the mountains. He found the tunnels under the Misty Mountains and descended into them, and the ring stretched his life out across the centuries the way it stretched everything it touched, preserving him past any natural span, keeping him in a kind of suspended state that was not living in any full sense but was also not dying. A prolonged maintenance of existence in which the ring was both the source of that maintenance and its purpose. What the ring did to Sméagol is the most intimate account we have of what prolonged possession means. The transformation was not sudden. It was gradual in the way that all the deepest changes are gradual, each day slightly less than the day before, each year the self a little more eroded, a little more replaced by the consuming relationship with the object. He developed a second voice, or rather the internal division that had always been present in him, the conflict between the remnant of what he had been and the hunger that the ring amplified, became so pronounced that it resolved into something resembling two separate identities. Gollum, the name his family had given him in the last days before his exile for the horrible gulping sound he made in his throat, became the name for the ring-hungry creature. Sméagol, the name he had been born with, became the name for the remnant that occasionally surfaced in later years, the part that could be reached by kindness, the part that still, after 500 years in the dark, remembered what warmth felt like. The underground lake was his world. The lake had fish, and the fish were cold and silver in the dark water, and catching them required the patience that 5 centuries in the dark had given him in abundance. He could see in near complete darkness with the wide, pale eyes that the ring's influence had developed, and he moved on the lake in his little boat with the silence of a creature that had learned to be quieter than the water. He had no sense of time passing in any conventional way. The dark was always the same dark. The lake was always the same lake. The ring was always in his pocket or on his finger, warm and real in a world where very little else was. The centuries were not experienced as duration the way they would be experienced by someone who could see the seasons change. They were experienced as the continuation of a single unchanging present, which is perhaps the most terrible kind of duration there is. Frodo would see Gollum's division clearly during their journey together, would feel it as the defining tension in the creature who led them toward Mordor, the question of which self would prevail in any given moment. Gandalf had seen it too, had counselled Frodo to pity Gollum, not from weakness or naive sentiment, but from the specific understanding that pity in this case was also a kind of strategy, that the ember of Sméagol in the creature was the one flicker of something that the ring had not entirely consumed, and that ember had a role to play before the story ended. The pity was not wrong, and it was not wasted. It was exactly the right response to a creature who was both what the ring had made him and also, buried very deep, what he had been before the ring found him in the river. It is worth sitting with what the ring costs in Gollum's person, as a way of understanding what it is. The ring extended his life, but it did not enrich it. It preserved his existence, but it hollowed out everything that made existence worth preserving. His senses, sharpened by centuries of hunting in the dark into something extraordinary by normal standards, and grotesque by any standard that includes the quality of the life those senses served. He had been made into a perfect creature for his environment. His environment was a dark tunnel under a mountain where he had been alone for 500 years. The ring had optimized him for misery, which is the most efficient description of what very long possession by the wrong kind of thing tends to accomplish. The ring left the mountain the same year Bilbo found it. Gollum's howl in the tunnels when he discovered its absence is one of the sounds that Bilbo heard as he ran toward the light and chose not to look back toward. It was the sound of a creature whose entire purpose had been taken from it, whose 500 years of careful hoarding had been undone in a single moment by someone who had no idea what they were carrying away. Gollum would follow. He would follow because he had no other direction. Without the ring he was nothing, or rather he was only the diminished remnant of what he had been before the ring arrived, and made itself his everything. He would follow the ring across the long years of the Third Age and find it again in the dark, and in finding it again would play the role that no one had planned for him, the role that Bilbo's mercy in the tunnel had made possible. Sam Gamgee would never fully trust Gollum, and Sam's distrust was not wrong. But it was also not the whole picture. The whole picture required Gollum to be alive when the moment arrived, and the moment arrived because a hobbit in a dark tunnel chose not to use a sword. Rest in the dark of the tunnel now, the quiet dark, the deep dark that is not frightening but simply old. The mountain is cold above, the lake is still below, and somewhere ahead, a crack of light. Follow it. The morning is on the other side of it, and the morning is warm. The underground lake is one of the strangest places in Middle-earth's geography, stranger even than the obvious wonders of elven cities and dwarven mines and the great towers of Sauron. It is strange precisely because it is unremarkable, because nothing about it is designed or intentional except in the negative sense, except in the sense of being the place that happened to be available when a ruined creature needed somewhere to hide from the world and from itself. The lake did not choose Gollum. Gollum chose the lake because it was dark enough and isolated enough, and because the fish in it were catchable. It became his world by default, by the slow accumulation of days that became years that became centuries, each one identical to the one before it, each one adding its small increment to the total weight of an existence that had no direction left except deeper into the dark. What Gollum knew, that no one who has not held the ring for centuries can fully understand, is the specific texture of the ring's presence. Not a voice, not a thought, something more like a temperature, a warmth that was always there when the ring was on his finger or in his palm, a warmth that was not the warmth of fire or the warmth of another body, but the warmth of being wanted by something, of being necessary to something, of having a purpose even if that purpose was only to hold and keep and protect. The ring needed him, or it felt to him like the ring needed him, which is perhaps the same thing from the inside of 500 years of sole possession. The ring had given him exactly one thing across all those centuries, which was the feeling of being indispensable, and the loss of that feeling when Bilbo's hand closed around the ring in the tunnel, dark was so complete and so sudden that it took the shape of everything he had ever understood about his own existence and removed it at once. The fish in the underground lake were Gollum's only remaining connection to the living world in any nutritive sense, and the way he caught them tells you something about what 5 centuries of the ring's influence had made him. He was extraordinarily patient. He could sit motionless on a rock at the water's edge for hours, watching the dim movement of fish below the surface with eyes that had adapted to the near dark into something that no longer quite resembled the eyes the store hobbits had been born with. He caught them with his hands, bare-handed in the cold water, with a speed and accuracy that required the complete quieting of the ordinary fidget of a conscious creature. The ring had given him this, It had stripped away everything that created noise at the surface of his existence, all the hopes and memories and social connections and ordinary desires that make people restless, and what remained was something very close to pure function. He was very good at catching fish. He was not much else. The Shire is not an accident. This is the thing that is easiest to miss about the place and the people who live there, because the Shire presents itself so thoroughly as the opposite of significance, as the world's most determined argument that nothing important is happening here, that the very comfort and ordinariness of the place constitute a kind of camouflage for the remarkable quality of the people it produces. Hobbits do not seek adventure. They regard the very concept with a suspicion so deep and so culturally embedded that it has become a mark of good character to want nothing to do with it. They love their pipes and their gardens and their 7 meals a day, and the particular pleasure of a fire in the hearth on a cold evening, and the specific comfort of a bed that is exactly the right size for the person in it. They love these things not because they are simple or unimaginative, but because they have made a sophisticated cultural choice to prioritize the domestic virtues over the heroic ones. The Shire is not the absence of wisdom. It is wisdom of a particular kind, the wisdom of knowing what actually makes life good and choosing it deliberately. Let that thought settle in you as you rest. The wisdom of the hearth, the specific, underrated intelligence of knowing what you value and building your life around it, rather than around what impresses other people. Let your breath slow and your muscles release their held tensions, and let the feeling of where you are resting right now, in your particular room, in your particular night, be enough. The hobbits would understand that feeling. They would say, "You had it exactly right." Bilbo Baggins was, at the point in his life when the story begins, 60 years old and in the prime of a hobbit's life. He lived at Bag End in Hobbiton, the finest hole in the hill, a place of round green doors and well-tended gardens and a pantry so well stocked that unexpected visitors could be accommodated without discomfort, though Bilbo would have told you firmly that he preferred expected ones. He was considered by his neighbours and his community entirely respectable. This was the highest social compliment the Shire could offer, and Bilbo wore it as such, with a satisfaction that was genuine and a slightly defensive pride that suggested he was aware of a complication in his character that respectable didn't quite contain. The complication was the Took half of him. His mother had been Belladonna Took, of the old Took's family, and the Tooks were known throughout the Shire for an occasional tendency towards strangeness that polite society attributed to something unsettling in their ancestry. They went on journeys, they had adventures, they came back with stories that made comfortable hobbits uncomfortable, and with a quality of having been touched by the wider world that never entirely wore off. Bilbo had inherited something of this tendency, and had spent 60 years sitting on it carefully, maintaining his respectability through the conscious effort of a person who knows that a part of himself would, if given any encouragement at all, do something completely unreasonable. The Took part of him was not dormant, it was suppressed. There is a difference, and the difference matters when a wizard appears at the gate. Gandalf. The name means different things to different people in Middle-earth, and the thing it means to hobbits is a combination of mild alarm and genuine wonder, because Gandalf means fireworks at midsummer parties, and extraordinary smoke rings and stories told well past a reasonable bedtime, and the particular quality of disruption that comes from someone who treats the ordinary world as a thin layer over something much more interesting. He had known Bilbo's mother. He had watched the Took streak in Bilbo with the specific interest of someone who understood what that streak might mean if it were ever allowed to express itself. And on a spring morning that Bilbo would later describe as perfectly ordinary until it absolutely wasn't, Gandalf leaned on his staff outside Bag End and told Bilbo that he was looking for someone to share in an adventure. Bilbo said no. He said no firmly and politely, and with all the weight of 60 years of respectable hobbit culture behind him, said good morning and meant it as a dismissal, went back inside and put the kettle on, and convinced himself that was the end of it. The next evening, 13 dwarves came to dinner. This is the moment that the Took part of Bilbo had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting, the moment when the suppressed tendency towards strangeness found that the world had arranged itself around it in a way that made the reasonable choice and the interesting choice point in the same direction. The dwarves filled his hole and ate his food and spoke of gold and dragons and a mountain that had been stolen and a journey so long and so uncertain that the odds against success were considerable. Bilbo fainted. When he came around, something had shifted in him like a door opening in a room that had always been locked. He ran out of Bag End the next morning without his handkerchief, without his hat, in a state of breathless urgency that the neighbours found entirely undignified, and that Bilbo himself would later claim he had no satisfactory explanation for, which was not quite true. The explanation was that something in him had recognised, in the map the dwarves carried and the dragon's lair it described, and the wild implausibility of the whole enterprise, something that the Took part of him had always suspected the world contained, and the Baggins part of him had always hoped it didn't. The world was larger than the Shire. It was genuinely, vertiginously, wonderfully larger, and the door to the larger world had been left ajar for exactly one morning, and Bilbo ran through it before the Baggins part of him could win the argument. He would never be the same afterward. This is not simply the observation that travel changes people, which is true and unremarkable. It is the specific observation that Bilbo went out a hobbit who contained the Shire entirely, and came back a hobbit who contained the Shire and also everything that lay beyond it, and that the everything beyond it did not displace the Shire but sat alongside it, enlarging the total without diminishing the particular. He would still love his pantry and his pipe and his garden. He would love them with the deeper appreciation of someone who had been without them for a year and had not died from the absence. What the journey added to him was not a replacement for who he was, but a confirmation of something that had always been there, waiting to be tested. He was braver than he knew. This is a thing that can only be discovered by being placed in situations that require bravery. The ring was not the most important thing Bilbo found on his adventure. He found himself, which is the oldest and most reliable destination of every genuine journey outward. He discovered that the Baggins part and the Took part were not opposites but partners, that the love of comfort and the capacity for extraordinary action could coexist in the same person, that you could love a well-stocked pantry and still face a dragon in a dark mountain without the love of the pantry making you a coward, or the facing of the dragon making you unable to come home. He came back to the Shire changed, and the Shire received him back changed, and the life he lived in the years that followed was a life that contained both things, the Shire and the world beyond it, held together by a character that had been tested and had not broken. But the ring was there, quiet in his pocket, doing what it did to everything it touched for long enough, which was to make itself feel necessary, feel like a natural feature of the landscape of daily life, feel like something that simply belonged rather than something with history and agenda. It was in his pocket when the dragon died, and in his pocket on the long walk home, and in his pocket through the first autumn evening back at Bag End, the fire lit and the pantry restocked, and the house returned to order. The ring, which had been waiting in the dark for almost 2,000 years before Bilbo's hand found it, had found its next arrangement. It would be patient. It had always been patient. And now it had a pocket in the Shire to rest in while the world turned. Frodo's name is in the songs because he carried the ring to the fire. But Bilbo's name is the first name, the unexpected name, the name that appears before the quest begins. Without Bilbo running, without his handkerchief, on a morning in April, the whole vast story of the War of the Ring balances on nothing. Let that smallness be the last thing you hold tonight. The smallest choices can carry the whole weight of history without knowing that they do. Sleep in that knowledge. It is lighter than you think. There is something in the specific geography of Hobbiton and the hill and the river water running below it that Tolkien put into the world as a description of a kind of peace that is not naive or unearned, but that is the result of a deliberate orientation toward the small and specific rather than the large and abstract. The Shire is not Arcadia, not the pastoral fantasy of people who have never actually had to grow anything. It is a working landscape, a place of farms and mills, and the genuine labour of growing and preserving and trading and building that sustains a community across generations. The hobbits work. They are good at it. The good life in the Shire is a life of skilled work and good relationships and enough leisure to enjoy what the work has produced. It is, in the most fundamental sense, a civilization that has figured out what matters and arranged itself around those things, which is rarer and harder than it looks. Gandalf's relationship with the Shire, and with hobbits in general, is one of the story's subtler and more interesting threads. He is a Maya, one of the angelic beings who came to Middle-earth in the Third Age to help the Free Peoples resist Sauron, and his usual companions are kings and elven lords and the great figures of the age. His affection for hobbits, his specific attention to the Took line, his decision to involve Bilbo in the dwarves' quest, and his longer campaign to prepare the Shire for its role in what was coming. All of this reflects an understanding that the great powers of the age were not sufficient to the task before them, and that the answer would come from somewhere they were not looking for it. He did not tell Bilbo or Frodo what they were ultimately for. He gave them what they needed and trusted what was in them. This is, in its own way, a form of pity, the specific pity of a being who loves something enough to trust it rather than to manage it. Bag End was, in the years between Bilbo's return and his departure for the last time, a place that embodied a particular kind of paradox. It was entirely ordinary and slightly extraordinary simultaneously. Ordinary in its function as a hobbit hole of the better sort, with its round door and its well-tended garden and its pantry that was never quite empty regardless of how many unexpected guests arrived, and extraordinary in the quality of life conducted within it. Bilbo read widely and thought carefully and wrote with a precision unusual in a hobbit, and the conversation at his table was, by the Shire's standards, somewhat challenging in the best possible way. He had seen things and thought about them, and the thinking had produced over the decades a kind of wisdom that was quiet and specific, and deeply at odds with the comfortable certainties of Shire society. He was odd because he had been made larger by his experience, and the Shire, which valued a certain manageable size in its members, found largeness difficult to accommodate. The specific quality of Bilbo's courage on the adventure is worth naming precisely, because it is not the kind of courage that appears in the traditional heroic literature of Middle-earth, the courage of the warrior who faces the enemy in open combat and does not flinch. It is a more domestic kind of courage, the courage of someone who is frightened and uncomfortable, and out of their depth, and simply refuses to stop trying to be useful. He did not want to be in the Spider's Forest or in the Dragon's Tunnel, or on the battlefield at the end. He wanted to be home with his kettle on. He was there anyway, doing the things that needed doing, which is the courage that most lives actually require, and that the heroic tradition tends to undervalue, because it does not make for good songs. The Hobbit's courage is the courage of the person who does not feel brave and keeps going anyway. It is by most measures the harder kind. The tunnels under the Misty Mountains are not a place anyone enters by choice. They are entered by misfortune, or by the decision of a goblin patrol, which amounts to the same thing when you are a party of dwarves and a hobbit trying to cross the mountains in weather that has made the passes impossible. The tunnels are cold in a way that stone is cold, deeply and thoroughly and without the variability of temperature in the open air, cold that does not change with the hour or the season but simply is, a permanent feature of the underground world as constant as the darkness. The darkness in the tunnels is similarly complete, the kind of dark that makes the difference between having your eyes open or closed irrelevant, that makes you aware of your other senses in a way that ordinary darkness does not, because ordinary darkness can always be resolved by a candle or a moon. This dark resolves into nothing. It is the purest form of dark there is, the dark of a place the sun has never reached, and toward which no light has ever travelled with any expectation of arriving. Let your eyes close fully now. Let whatever light exists in your room become nothing if it will. Imagine the darkness behind your eyelids as the beginning of the tunnel's dark, the first layer of it, and beneath that first layer more layers, going down and down, until the dark is a place you are inside rather than a condition outside you. This is not a frightening dark, it is a deep one. There is a difference. The deep dark is where the oldest stories live, where the oldest things wait quietly to be found. Bilbo lost the dwarves in the confusion of a goblin attack in the tunnel, lost them completely, in the dark and the noise and the desperate running through passages he could not see, until the running stopped and the noise stopped and he was alone in a silence so complete that he could hear his own breathing and his own heartbeat, with a clarity that seemed wrong, too loud, too specific, as if the silence were listening. He lay still for a long time. He felt around him with his hands and found only stone, smooth and cold as old ice, and the shape of the floor curving gently under him where he had fallen. He was not hurt. He was profoundly alone in the deepest dark he had ever been in. The Baggins part of him was cataloguing the reasons to panic. The Took part of him, to its own surprise, was quiet and attentive. His hand found the ring on the floor before his eyes could have found anything. His fingers moved across the stone and touched a small circle of metal, and he picked it up without thinking, with the automatic action of a person who finds a thing on the ground and pockets it, a gesture so ordinary that it required no decision. It was the most consequential ordinary gesture in the history of the Third Age. He put it in his pocket and got up and began to feel his way along the wall of the tunnel in the direction he hoped was forward. He did not know what he had found. The ring did not announce itself. It sat in his pocket and was warm and was quiet and waited. The underground lake he found by the sound of it, the quiet lapping of still water against a stone shore, a sound so small in the immense silence that he almost missed it. He stopped at the edge of it and let his eyes adjust to a dark that no adjustment could improve, and listened to the lake existing in the dark around him, and felt the particular quality of smallness that very large enclosed spaces produce in the people who stand in them. He could not see the ceiling, he could not see the far shore, he could see nothing at all in any direction, and the lake was enormous in the dark the way invisible things can be enormous, their size defined entirely by the sound of them and the quality of the air above them. And then he heard something else, not the lake, something on the lake, the sound of a small boat being paddled and pale eyes in the dark. Gollum had lived beside the lake for 500 years. He had eaten the fish from it and spoken to it on the evenings when even the ring's company was not enough, and he needed something to address, and he knew its every inlet and depth and the particular sound each section of its shore made when the water moved against it. He had not heard anyone here in so long that the sound of Bilbo's breathing was almost incomprehensible at first, a sound that did not belong to this place, a warm-blooded sound in a cold-blooded world. He approached across the lake in his little boat, and he looked at the small shape of the hobbit standing on the shore, and the hunger in him was both the ordinary kind and the deeper kind that the ring had long since made indistinguishable. What saved Bilbo in those first moments was not the ring, which he had not yet discovered the use of, and not bravery in any conventional sense. It was the riddle game. It was the specific cultural tradition of the hobbits, and, as it turned out, of Gollum's own people before the ring had taken everything else, that certain kinds of contest were governed by rules, and that a game of riddles was one of them, and that the stakes could be named before it began and honoured at its end. Bilbo proposed the game with his sword already in his hand, and a desperation he was trying not to show, and Gollum accepted it because 500 years in the dark had not entirely extinguished the part of him that remembered what games were and why creatures played them. The riddles they exchanged in the dark beside the lake are among the most ancient forms of intellectual contest known to the peoples of Middle-earth. A riddle is a kind of koan, a question whose answer is already contained in the asking for anyone patient enough to look at it from the right angle. The riddles Bilbo knew came from the Shire and from the comfortable tradition of fireside contests at midsummer, riddles about eggs and teeth and wind and time, riddles designed to entertain rather than to test survival. The riddles Gollum knew were older and darker, riddles shaped by centuries alone in the underground, riddles about cold and darkness, and the specific things that survive when everything warm has been extinguished. They were well matched in a way that neither of them understood as well matched, each bringing to the contest exactly the kind of knowledge that the other's experience had not produced. The ring in Bilbo's pocket changed the ending. His last riddle was not, strictly speaking, a riddle at all. What have I got in my pocket was a question rather than a riddle, sprung in a moment of desperation when his mind had gone blank, and Gollum was growing impatient and the game was about to resolve badly. Gollum guessed and guessed and guessed wrong, and by the rules of the game he had agreed to, he was bound to show Bilbo the way out. What Bilbo had in his pocket was the one thing in the world that Gollum needed more than his next breath. The one thing that Gollum could feel the absence of with every heartbeat, the hollow where the ring had been when it was on his finger, and the cold recognition that it was gone. The ring had passed from Gollum to Bilbo through the medium of a riddle about a pocket, through the most mundane possible container for the most consequential possible object. Bilbo ran toward the light at the end of the tunnel. Behind him he could hear Gollum's cry, rising and falling in the dark, and the sound of it followed him toward the entrance. The sound of grief and rage combined in a voice that had forgotten most of what grief and rage were for, except as they applied to a single lost object. Bilbo ran, and the light grew ahead of him, and the cold of the tunnel began to give way to the cold of the outside air, and he came out into the daylight on the far side of the mountains with the ring in his pocket, and the riddle game behind him, and the journey still mostly ahead. Frodo, years later, hearing the full account of how the ring had come to Bilbo, would feel the strangeness of it in the specific way that very important things, whose origins are very small, tend to produce strangeness when their full significance is understood. The fate of the world had hinged on a hobbit's hand moving across a stone floor in the dark, on a riddle game tradition just barely surviving in one desperate late-night contest, on the ring itself finding in the pocket of a small person from the Shire exactly the kind of invisibility it needed. Let that pocket, and that stone floor, and that dark carry you now into your own rest. The large things and the small things are not as separate as they appear. The riddle game's rules are ancient in Middle-earth, honoured across cultures that disagree about nearly everything else, which suggests that riddles answer some need that is prior to cultural difference, some need that is built into the kind of consciousness that can hold two things in mind simultaneously and find the unexpected relationship between them. A riddle is a compressed comparison, a description of something by describing something else that shares its essential structure. Teeth and time and wind and darkness and the sun, the classic subjects of the oldest riddles, are compared to things that seem entirely unlike them until the comparison reveals the shared structure beneath the surface difference. Solving a riddle is a small experience of the larger experience of understanding, the moment when two apparently separate things reveal themselves to be one thing seen from different angles. Bilbo's advantage in the riddle game was not greater cleverness. He and Gollum were, across the course of the contest, quite evenly matched. His advantage was his question, which broke the rules in a way that the rules he was invoking could not have anticipated. What have I got in my pocket is not a riddle because it has no answer that the questioner can derive from the question alone. It requires information that only the questioner possesses. In a riddle game where both parties are bound by the convention that a riddle has an answer accessible in principle to anyone who thinks about it carefully. The question about the pocket was a violation of the contract. Gollum sensed this and protested, and Bilbo gave him 3 chances rather than 1, which was both fair and generous in the circumstances, and also the kind of fairness that a person shows when the took part of them has gotten them into a situation that the Baggins part feels honour bound to handle decently. What Bilbo did not know, slipping the ring onto his finger in the dark and finding himself invisible, was that the ring's invisibility worked on the mortal world by drawing the wearer partly into the Wraith world, the dim parallel existence where the Nazgul moved and where Sauron's power was most immediately felt. The invisibility was not simply a removal from sight, it was a shift in the nature of what you were, a partial translation from the fully material to the partially immaterial, from the world of solid things into the world of shadows. Prolonged use of the ring for invisibility was, in a way Bilbo never fully understood, prolonged exposure to the Wraith world, prolonged standing in the doorway between what is materially present and what is spiritually present, and that prolonged standing had effects that accumulated over time in ways that were not immediately visible from outside, but that Gandalf could see clearly in the quality of Bilbo's presence after 60 years of possession. The underground lake itself is a geographical fact of the sort that the mountains produce when they fold and fault over geological time, creating enclosed spaces that were never intended by any consciousness, but that nevertheless have the quality of intention, of having been shaped for some purpose. The lake's particular quality, its stillness and its complete silence, and its isolation from any other water, gave it a character that Gollum had absorbed over 5 centuries of proximity. He knew it the way a person knows a room they have lived in alone for a very long time, knew its moods and its sounds and the particular way its surface moved when something disturbed it from below, knew it as one knows something that has been the entire world. The lake was not his friend, it was not capable of friendship, but it was his, in the only sense of possession available to someone whose relationship to possession had been reduced to its simplest possible form. There is a moment in the tunnel, after the riddle game, after Bilbo slipped the ring onto his finger and found himself invisible and followed the enraged and bewildered Gollum toward the exit, when the story could have ended in a way that would have changed everything. Bilbo had his sword, Gollum was ahead of him, leading him toward the gate without knowing it, and Bilbo, invisible and afraid and desperate to get out of the mountain, had a clear advantage he had not possessed at any earlier point in the night. The thought came to him, in the way that practical thoughts come in desperate situations, that the simplest resolution to the problem of Gollum was the one his sword made available. And then the thought moved, in a direction he had not entirely anticipated, away from simplicity and toward something else. It moved toward Gollum's face in the pale light of the creature's own eyes, the specific quality of misery that face contained, and it moved toward pity. Let your breathing find its own rhythm now, in and out, gentle and unhurried. We are approaching something in this segment that is very quiet and very important, something that happens in a fraction of a second in a dark tunnel, and whose consequences take 60 years to fully reveal themselves. The largest things often happen in the smallest moments. This is one of them. Hold it gently. What stopped Bilbo was not strategy. It was not the calculation that Gollum might be useful later, or the practical assessment that killing in the dark while invisible was risky. It was something simpler and less logical, and in the end more significant than either of those things. It was pity. A sudden understanding, felt rather than reasoned, that the wretched creature ahead of him in the dark was wretched rather than simply dangerous, that the thing Gollum had become was not entirely what Gollum had chosen to be, that 500 years alone in the dark with only a ring for company produced a kind of suffering that made straightforward condemnation feel inadequate, that the creature splashing in the dark water and crying for its precious was not a monster in any simple sense, but a ruined person, and that there was a difference between a monster and a ruined person, and the difference mattered. He leapt over Gollum instead. A moment of agility that surprised him, as much as it surprised the creature below him, and then he was running toward the crack of light he could see ahead that Gollum had been leading him toward without knowing he was being followed, and behind him, Gollum's cries faded into the dark of the tunnel, and the dark of the lake and the dark that had been Gollum's whole world for 5 centuries, and Bilbo ran toward the light with the ring in his pocket, and the mercy he had just shown sitting in him, like something he had not expected to feel, something that did not quite have a name yet, but that was real, and that would matter in ways he could not begin to anticipate. Gandalf wept. Not in the moment, not when Bilbo told the story, but in the telling he gave much later to Frodo. Gandalf described the mercy in the tunnel as the most important moment in the whole long history of the quest for the ring. More important than the riddle game. More important than Bilbo finding the ring on the floor. More important, in a certain sense, than Frodo's decision to take the ring to Mordor. Because the mercy in the tunnel was the event that made the ending possible, in a way that would not be apparent for 60 years, and that no one, including Bilbo himself, understood at the time. A decision made without understanding its consequences is still a decision. Pity extended without knowing what the pity would eventually accomplish is still pity, and the world needed it in exactly the form and at exactly the moment it was given. Gollum lived because Bilbo pitied him. Gollum lived to follow Frodo and Sam into Mordor, to serve as their guide through lands that no map adequately described, through the marshes and the passes that only a creature shaped by the ring's long companionship could navigate. Gollum lived to carry the ring, in those last terrible moments at the crack of doom when Frodo, standing at the edge of the fire, found that the ring's will was stronger than his own, and claimed it rather than destroying it. Gollum, driven by the consuming need that 5 centuries of possession had made the whole of his existence, took the ring from Frodo's finger with a violence born of absolute desire and fell into the fire, and the ring was destroyed, and the world was saved by the last act of a creature that the world had written off as irredeemable long before he reached that final moment. Bilbo did not know any of this when he leapt over Gollum in the dark. He did not know that the mercy he was extending was anything other than a choice he was making in a moment, on the basis of a feeling he couldn't fully articulate, not to do the thing his fear and his desperation were suggesting. He just chose not to kill a miserable creature in the dark, that was all, and it was everything. This is the thing about Tolkien's understanding of pity that runs beneath the whole of the story like a river beneath the ground. Pity is not weakness. Pity is not naivety. Pity is a form of attention, a willingness to look at something suffering and see the suffering rather than only the threat. It requires a particular kind of courage, actually, the courage to pause in a dangerous moment and extend your imagination past your own fear into the experience of the creature that is frightening you. Bilbo had it. Frodo had it, having learned from Bilbo and from Gandalf, and the story required it to be present at exactly the moments when it was, because without it the strategy of every great mind involved in the quest for the ring's destruction would have been insufficient. The ring could not be resisted ultimately by power or wisdom. It was destroyed by the last act of a creature whose life had been spared by pity 60 years earlier in a dark tunnel under a mountain. Sam Gamgee understood this after the fact in a way that Sam understood most things, which is to say practically and without ornament. He had not trusted Gollum. He had been right not to trust Gollum in any conventional sense, and yet he had seen what Gollum was and seen also, dimly, what Gollum had been. And in the long reflection that followed the end of the quest, he arrived at the uncomfortable understanding that his distrust, however accurate in its immediate assessment, had missed something that Frodo's pity had caught. There is no simple lesson here about always extending mercy. The lesson, if there is one, is smaller and harder, which is that sometimes the most important contribution a damaged creature can make requires that creature to be alive when the moment arrives, and you cannot always know in advance which damaged creature that will be. The deeper implication is one that Tolkien placed in the story without announcing it, the way the deepest things in stories are always placed. Good intentions are not sufficient. Power is not sufficient. Wisdom is not sufficient. Even courage is not sufficient. What was sufficient in the end was pity extended in a dark tunnel by a small person who did not know what they were doing and did it anyway because it felt like the right thing in the moment. The eucatastrophe, the sudden joyous turn at the story's end, was prepared in that moment. Every good ending has a moment somewhere in its past where someone chose to be kinder than the situation required. Bilbo came out of the mountain on the far side and sat on a rock in the afternoon sun and put his hand in his pocket and felt the ring and turned it over in his fingers and decided not to mention it to the dwarves. This decision, made quickly and without much apparent reflection, was the ring beginning its quiet work on him. Not a dramatic compulsion, just a small, comfortable feeling preference for keeping something private, for letting the ring be his secret. It was so small a beginning that it almost wasn't a beginning at all. Almost. Let the afternoon sun on that rock be the last image you hold tonight. Bilbo in the warmth with his hand in his pocket, the mountain behind him, the world changing, very quietly, one small decision at a time. Tolkien wrote about the moment in the tunnel in a way that connects it explicitly to the broader theme of the eucatastrophe, the sudden joyous turn that he considered the essential element of what he called fairy story, and that he believed was present in the deepest stories because it was present in the deepest structure of reality. The eucatastrophe is not the happy ending in the sense of the problem being solved. It is this sudden, unexpected, undeserved grace that arrives when the problem has become insoluble by ordinary means. Bilbo's pity in the tunnel is not yet the eucatastrophe. It is the preparation for it, 60 years in advance, the seed of the thing that will be needed planted in a moment when the planter has no idea what they are planting or what it will eventually grow into. The deeper logic of pity in this story is connected to Tolkien's understanding of what evil ultimately is and what it cannot do. Evil, in his understanding, can corrupt and diminish and destroy, but it cannot create. Everything that Sauron made was made by twisting what already existed. The orcs were elves once. The ring was made with elvish craft and elvish knowledge. The power that Sauron built his dominion on was borrowed from the structure of the world rather than native to himself. And so the thing he could not account for, the thing that his ring could not finally overcome, was the quality of mercy extended freely, without calculation, without expectation of return. The ring had no category for pity because pity is a form of gift-giving, and the ring's entire design was around the logic of taking. Bilbo's mercy in the tunnel was the one variable in the equation that the ring's maker had not included. There is a long tradition in the stories of many cultures of the hero who spares the enemy that the story later reveals to have been necessary. The king who shows mercy to the defeated and finds the defeated later saving his life. The warrior who does not strike the killing blow and discovers later that the one spared had a role that the killing would have prevented. These stories are told so often precisely because they describe something real about the structure of consequential action in a world whose full consequences are never visible at the moment of choice. The mercy and its eventual payoff are not connected by any mechanism visible at the time of extension. They are connected by the simple fact that a living creature, rather than a dead one, was present when the moment of need arrived. Bilbo's mercy in the tunnel was the purest version of this pattern that the tradition contains, because the gap between the extension and the payoff was 60 years, and because the payoff was the salvation of the world. Bilbo sat on the rock outside the mountain for a long time in the afternoon sun before the dwarves found him and asked where he had been and how he had managed to get past the goblins. He told them some of the truth and not all of it. He had found a ring, he said, and it had helped him get past the goblins, and he'd come out on this side of the mountain, and that was essentially the shape of it. The ring in his pocket was warm and specific and private, and the feeling of privacy around it was already developing the quality that it would have for 60 years, the quality of a thing that was his and no one else's, and that he preferred to keep that way not because keeping it served any particular purpose, but because the preference was simply there, simple and comfortable and not requiring any further justification. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the ring, and felt the afternoon sun on his face, and was glad to be outside and alive and out of the mountain. Bilbo came home to Bag End and found that he had been declared legally dead, and his possessions were being auctioned off on the lawn, which was the Shire's practical way of dealing with a hobbit who had been absent for a year without explanation. And he bought back what he most wanted and settled in, and began to be considered, by a new and less comfortable consensus, rather peculiar. The neighbours who had found him thoroughly respectable before the journey revised their assessment based on the evidence. He had visitors of the wrong sort, meaning dwarves and occasionally a wizard, meaning people from the outside world with all the disruption that implied. He wrote things down in journals. He told stories about his adventure that were too large and too specific to be the comfortable Shire exaggerations of a modest traveller, that had instead the uncomfortable ring of things that had actually happened to a person. He was, by the Shire's very reasonable standards, no longer quite right. This assessment was both wrong and correct simultaneously, which is the most interesting kind of assessment. Let your breathing slow. The fire in the hearth at Bag End is lit and warm, and the smell of pipe smoke is in the air, and the pantry is well stocked, and the garden is precisely as Bilbo likes it, which is to say, extremely well tended and slightly unconventional by Shire standards. The world outside the round green door is quiet. The night is settling in over Hobbiton the way night settles, over places that have decided, by long consensus, that nothing too dramatic should happen here. Breathe it in. The ordinary is not the absence of the extraordinary, it is the place where the extraordinary rests between its appointments. Bilbo wrote the account of his journey. He wrote it carefully and at length, more carefully than he told it, because he understood that there was a difference between a story told at a party and a history told for people who were not there and needed to understand what had actually happened. He called it there and back again, and the there and back was the essential structure of the thing, the leaving and the returning, the world out there and the world in here, and the changed person who carried both of them now, in a way that the unchanged person had not needed to. He wrote the account of the tunnel, including the riddle game, and in the account of the riddle game he told the version where he had found the ring as a gift, rather than as a thing on the tunnel floor. He did not think carefully about why he told it that way. The preference for the gift version over the true version simply felt right to him, felt like the way the story should be told, felt like a small private matter rather than a lie. This preference was the ring's first written influence on the world. Gandalf noticed. He noticed in the way that Gandalf noticed things, which was to file the observation in a place that was not immediately actionable and let it sit there for years while he accumulated adjacent observations, building a picture that the individual observations did not separately reveal. He knew that Bilbo had a ring. He knew that Bilbo was unreasonably reluctant to discuss it or show it to anyone. He knew that Bilbo was aging more slowly than a hobbit of his years should age, and that 60 years after the journey, at the point in his life when a hobbit could reasonably expect to be visibly elderly, Bilbo looked essentially the same as he had looked at the adventure's end. This was extraordinary. Gandalf had seen one other creature in Middle-earth who looked the same, across an impossible span of years, while in possession of a small golden ring, and that creature was living under a mountain in the Misty Mountains, calling everything precious. The ring was making Bilbo feel stretched. He used this word himself, the only time he came close to articulating what the prolonged possession was doing to him, and the word was precise, stretched thin, like butter scraped over too much bread. Not diminished, not obviously damaged, not unwell in any way he could point to, or that any healer could identify. Simply stretched, as if the space of his inner life were being extended past its natural capacity by the years accumulating beyond what his nature was built to contain. 111 years old, with the appearance of a well-preserved middle-aged hobbit and the inner sense of a person who had been alive for more than a century and felt every year of it in ways he couldn't explain. The stretchness was not painful. It was the slow discomfort of something being held in a state it was not designed for. The way a muscle held in tension for too long is not in pain exactly, but is aware of the tension and would prefer it to resolve. The party was Gandalf's idea and Bilbo's, jointly, the grandest birthday celebration the Shire had ever seen, which was also a farewell that only Bilbo and Gandalf knew was a farewell. Bilbo was going to leave. He had been planning it in a vague and growing way for years, the sense that the world outside the Shire was still there and still large, and that he had not seen all of it that he wanted to see, that there were still roads and still stories, and that Bag End, beloved as it was, had perhaps been everything it was going to be for him. He was going to the elves. He was going to write and rest and live out whatever remained of his years in the company of people who understood the value of long memory and gentle peace. This plan was clear and coherent and right. The ring was the obstacle. Not an obstacle Bilbo had named as such, but an obstacle that became apparent the moment Gandalf gently suggested that Bilbo leave it behind for Frodo. The reaction was immediate and disproportionate, and entirely unlike Bilbo, who was a generous and fundamentally gentle person who loved his young cousin and had been planning all along to leave him Bag End and everything in it. "The ring was mine," he said, and the edge in his voice was the ring's edge, the ring's particular resistance to the idea of being given away, translated into the first person, and projected through a person who was too decent and too self-aware to sustain it for long. He caught himself. He looked at his hand and saw it clench around the ring in a fist. He opened his hand. He looked at the ring and saw it for a moment with unusual clarity, not as his precious thing, but as a thing separate from himself, a thing that had been in his pocket but was not him. He put the ring down on the floor and stepped back from it and left it there, and then he left Bag End and left the Shire, and the stretched feeling began to ease before he reached the gate. The years did not rush back to him immediately. He did not age suddenly in the way that the legends of things preserved by dark magic suggest. He aged slowly over the years that followed, as hobbits age, and the aging was experienced by him not as deterioration, but as a kind of settling, a return to the natural pace of things, a recovery of the ordinary relationship between a body and time that the ring had distorted for 60 years. This is the one thing that almost no one who has held the ring for any significant period was able to do, to set it down, to leave it behind. Gollum had held it for 500 years, and the idea of leaving it was physiologically impossible for him, indistinguishable from the idea of dying. Boromir held it in his imagination, and found himself unable to relinquish the idea even without touching it. Frodo, at the moment of truth at the crack of doom, found that the will that had sustained him across the whole terrible journey was not sufficient to overcome the ring's resistance to being destroyed. Bilbo put it on the floor and walked away. He needed Gandalf's help to do it. The help was firm and the moment was painful, but he did it. What made it possible, when it had been impossible for Gollum and nearly impossible for Frodo, was the 60 years of being genuinely himself in the presence of the ring. Bilbo had never stopped being Bilbo. The ring had stretched him and changed him in ways that were real and costly, but it had not replaced him. His fundamental character, the combination of Baggins' practicality and took curiosity, and the deep gentleness that had stopped a sword in a dark tunnel, was intact beneath the stretching. When Gandalf brought him to the moment of choice, Bilbo was still present enough in himself to make the choice. He was the only long-term ring-bearer who could say that. Frodo would find the ring in an envelope on the mantelpiece the next morning, left there with a note from Bilbo and a note from Gandalf, and the weight of an inheritance he did not yet understand. The ring would warm in his hand in the way that gold does not warm. And somewhere far away, Bilbo Baggins would be walking east into a world that was much larger than the Shire, feeling lighter with every step, the stretched feeling easing as the ring's distance increased. Let his lightness be yours for a moment. The thing you have been holding past the point it was good for you. Sometimes it is possible to put it on the floor and walk away. Let your hands open now, gently, and let the night hold what you set down. The Shire's response to Bilbo's increased peculiarity over the 60 years of his possession of the ring is worth dwelling on for a moment, because the Shire's response is the response of a healthy community to the presence of something it cannot categorize. The Shire did not cast Bilbo out. It considered him odd. It gossiped about him. It noticed him, and kept a weather eye and maintained the social distance that a community maintains from someone who has been changed by something the community has no framework for understanding. And within that distance, it also loved him, in the way that communities love their eccentrics when the eccentricity is benign, which Bilbo's was. He was generous with his time and his money and his stories, and the Shire, which has good instincts about fundamental character even when surface behaviour is puzzling, understood that the oddness was not malice. The mithril coat that Bilbo gave to Frodo in Rivendell is one of the quieter threads of provision that run through the story, the way that things given years before in circumstances that seem unrelated to the present crisis arrive exactly when they are needed. The coat saved Frodo's life on the slopes of Caradhras and in the depths of Moria. Bilbo had owned it for 60 years without knowing its full value, had kept it as a memento of the adventure, a physical remnant of the world beyond the Shire that he carried back with him, and never quite stopped carrying. When he gave it to Frodo, he was giving everything he had that was substantial, not the ring, which was no longer his to give, but the armour that had been made to protect someone small in a world built for larger people. This is what the old give the young when they cannot give them anything else. The things that kept them alive passed forward in the hope they will serve again. The party at Bilbo's 111th birthday was the last great gathering in the Shire before the world changed, and the Shire itself, in its characteristic way, did not know that was what it was. The fireworks were the finest anyone present had ever seen. The food was extraordinary. The speech was short and satisfying and contained Bilbo's last gift to Shire society, which was the spectacle of a very old hobbit who had been everywhere and done everything behaving, in his final public appearance, exactly like a hobbit, exactly like himself, the same person who had lived in that hole for 111 years, with the same round green door and the same garden, and the same genuine pleasure in a well-set table. The speech ended with good evening, and he vanished, literally, with the ring on his finger, and the Shire stood in the field and laughed because it looked like a very good trick, which it was and was not. Gandalf did not come back to the Shire for 17 years after Bilbo's party. This is a span that feels enormous in the scale of hobbit life, where seasons matter and years accumulate with the particular weight of small lives fully lived. But that is something quite different in the scale of a Maya, who has been in Middle-earth for several thousand years and who moves through the world on timelines that hobbits are not well equipped to comprehend. The 17 years were not empty years. They were working years, years in which Gandalf moved through the old places of Middle-earth, through libraries and ruins and the memories of the oldest living things, following threads that grew increasingly alarming the more he pulled on them. He was doing what great minds do when they have found a question too large to think about quickly, which is to think about it slowly and completely, and to follow every lead however unpromising it appears, and to arrive at the answer only when all the evidence makes any other answer impossible. Let your body release whatever it is still holding from the day. The deliberate unhurrying of thought that Gandalf practiced across those 17 years is worth contemplating as you settle. Some things cannot be rushed. Some understandings have to accumulate layer by layer until the weight of them is sufficient to resolve the question they are answering. There is a particular kind of rest that belongs to a mind that has been working hard and has finally set the problem down for the night. That rest is available to you now. Let it come. He went to Minas Tirith first, or to the archives of Minas Tirith, to the deep records that the stewards of Gondor had maintained since the days of the Last Alliance and the fall of Sauron. He was looking for the account of Isildur's cutting of the ring from Sauron's hand, for the precise description of the object that had been taken and then lost, for any detail that would confirm or deny what he was beginning to suspect. He found the account. He found the physical description of the ring as Isildur had written it down, the plain gold band, the letters that appeared when it was heated, the black speech inscription. He sat in the archives with the account in his hands, and felt the weight of 1,700 years between Isildur's death in the Gladden Fields and the present moment, and felt also the specific gravity of what the evidence was pointing toward. The account that Isildur had left was brief and practical, written by a man who was a king and a soldier rather than a scholar, who recorded the ring's properties with the straightforward terseness of someone noting down a weapon's characteristics. The inscription appeared when the ring was heated, Isildur wrote, in letters of fire. The language was the black speech of Mordor. This much Gandalf could confirm from Isildur's description. He also noted that the ring felt heavier than its size suggested, a warmth in the gold that was not the warmth of the ambient temperature, and an unwillingness to be parted from him that he described as unusual in an object that had no consciousness. These last observations were things Isildur had recorded almost despite himself, the practical man noting what he had felt without quite being able to integrate what it implied. Gandalf read those observations and understood what Isildur had not fully understood. He went to Dol Guldur, which was a place he had been before and would need to go to again, the old fortress in the southern reaches of Mirkwood where a shadow had been growing for many long years. He had gone before and found what appeared to be a great necromancer in residence, a dark power of unclear origin and unclear purpose that had been spreading its influence through the forest and making the great woods slowly, steadily less inhabitable by anything that preferred the light. He had suspected then what he confirmed more fully now. The shadow in Dol Guldur was Sauron, diminished, not gone, not destroyed as the common understanding of the Second Age's ending suggested, present, patient, gathering strength, and looking for the one thing that would return him to his former power. The name of that one thing Gandalf now knew with certainty. It was in a hobbit hole in the Shire. He found Gollum's trail. Gollum had left the mountains the same year Bilbo had taken the ring, which was not a coincidence that Gandalf needed to work very hard to interpret. The ring's absence had made the mountain unbearable. Gollum was looking for it, moving through the world with the specific desperation of a creature whose whole existence had been reduced to a single consuming need, and who could not rest until that need was met. Gandalf tracked Gollum's movements for years through the reports of rangers, and through his own ranging and through the careful accumulation of account after account of a thin, pale creature seen near rivers and in caves, and along the edges of Mordor, drawn toward the dark as the dark was drawn toward the ring's location. He eventually caught him. The information Gollum provided, under what pressure Gandalf preferred not to specify, gave him the last piece of confirmation he needed. The ring had been found in the River Anduin, the Gladden Fields area where Isildur had died. It had been found by a creature of hobbit kind who called himself Gollum. It had been held in the mountains for 500 years. It had been found again by another creature of hobbit kind, a Baggins of the Shire, in a riddle game in a tunnel. The chain of custody was complete, from Sauron's hand to Isildur's, to the river, to Gollum's, to Bilbo's, and the chain led directly to the pocket of a hobbit in Bag End, who had been keeping it for 17 years without knowing what he had. Gandalf sat with this knowledge for a long time before returning to the Shire, not because he needed more time to be certain, but because certainty of this magnitude required the kind of careful sitting with that he had always practiced when facing things too large to rush. The fire test. He remembered it in the early morning hours of the night he returned to Bag End, standing in Frodo's comfortable sitting room, with the ring in his palm, carrying it to the hearth, with a deliberateness that Frodo found alarming in proportion to how little he understood what was being tested. He laid it in the coals. He waited. He took it out with the tongs and held it up and looked at it in the firelight, and the letters appeared on the band, the black speech letters that Isildur had described, the inscription of function and domination, visible now in the ordinary fire of a hobbit sitting room as they had been visible in Orodruin's fire on the day they were written. One ring to rule them all. The confirmation was complete. The object in his hand was the One Ring of Sauron, the Master Ring, the ring of power that contained a portion of the Dark Lord's own will, and whose destruction was the only way to permanently end the threat that Sauron represented. Frodo sat across the room and watched Gandalf's face in the firelight, and understood from the quality of that face, even before Gandalf spoke, that something had changed. That the comfortable evening he had been expecting had become something else, something that required a seriousness he had not been prepared for. This is the moment in the story when Frodo's life divides into before and after, the way all lives divide at the moments when they are required to be larger than they have previously needed to be. He did not know yet what would be required of him. He knew that whatever it was real, and it was large. Gandalf told Frodo the history of the ring that night in the sitting room, as completely as he could, the full account from Sauron's forging to Isildur's, keeping to the river, and Gollum's sentries in the dark and Bilbo's finding in the tunnel. The fire burned low as he told it. The night deepened outside the round window. Frodo held the ring in his handkerchief and felt it warm against his palm even through the cloth, and understood gradually that the warmth was not comfort and not benign, and not the warmth of the Shire's familiar evenings. 17 years of living in the same house as this thing, of having it on the mantelpiece and then in his pocket, of never quite forgetting it was there and never quite examining why he could never quite forget it. Let the fire burn low now. Let the room settle into the warm dark of a late evening in the Shire. You are on the safe side of the story, warmed by a fire that is ordinary and good, and sleep is very close. The ring is in a handkerchief on a table in a story that already has its ending, and that ending is not darkness. Let it come. The night is patient and warm and entirely yours. The 17 years of Gandalf's investigation are the story's long quiet, before the long loud of the Fellowship's journey, and they deserve more contemplation than they usually receive. Gandalf moved across Middle-earth in those years with the unhurried intentionality of a being who understands that the quality of an investigation determines the quality of its conclusions, and that a conclusion reached too quickly is worth less than a conclusion reached correctly. He was not idle. He was conducting what would be, in the annals of any intelligence service worthy of the name, one of the most methodical and consequential investigations of Nera. He was confirming the nature of an object, tracing the history of its possession, locating its current whereabouts, and assessing the threat landscape around it, all while maintaining his other responsibilities and not alerting the enemy that the investigation was occurring. The archive at Minas Tirith held things that even the stewards who maintained it did not fully understand. The records from the Second Age were the oldest records in Gondor's possession, copied and recopied over the centuries by scribes who understood the words without necessarily understanding their implications, who preserved the physical text without being able to assess what the text described. Gandalf was one of the few beings in Middle-earth who could walk into that archive and read the ancient documents, not as historical artifacts, but as current intelligence, who could look at Isildur's description of the ring's properties and recognize immediately what those properties implied about the ring's identity. He had been in the world long enough to know the difference between a ring that had been made by elven craft and one that had been made by Sauron with elven craft as his instrument, and the difference was legible in the account if you knew what to look for. The 19 rings of power were distributed across the peoples of Middle-earth in a way that reflected Sauron's understanding of their specific vulnerabilities. The elves received 3, and the 3 greatest elves who bore them were able to use them for their intended purpose, the preservation of the living world's beauty, precisely because they had never been under Sauron's direct instruction in the making, and because they took the rings off the moment they felt the One Ring's completion. The 7 given to dwarves did not accomplish what Sauron intended, because dwarves' nature was such that their will could not be bent by the rings into servitude, though the rings did amplify their love of gold and their tendency toward hoarding in ways that led to grief. The 9 given to men did exactly what Sauron designed them to do, drew their bearers gradually into the Wraith world, made them powerful and then dependent and then hollow, transformed them into the Nazgul, the ring wraiths who served as his most terrible servants. 9 rings to make 9 wraiths, and the 1 ring to command them all. The Shire in the 17 years between Bilbo's departure and Gandalf's return was the Shire as the Shire always had been and always was, which is to say mostly comfortable and mostly preoccupied with the ordinary business of Shire life, and not significantly different from the Shire of any other generation. The ring's presence in Bag End was not felt by the community at large. Frodo was considered a somewhat unconventional but fundamentally respectable hobbit, a good manager of Bag End and a decent neighbour, and a person whose friendship with the old adventurer Bilbo had given him some of Bilbo's unusual qualities without most of the extreme peculiarity. He was liked, in the moderate Shire way of liking someone who does not cause trouble and keeps their garden in reasonable order. The storm gathering in the world outside the Shire was entirely invisible from within it, which is perhaps the most precise description of what makes the Shire both fragile and precious. Frodo Baggins was 50 years old when Gandalf came back to the Shire and told him the truth about the ring, which sounds old to a human ear and is not particularly old by hobbit reckoning, but which is a specific age in Frodo's life that has a specific meaning. He was old enough to have developed, through the particular combination of Baggins' practicality and Took imagination, a genuine inner life and a genuine capacity for thought, and a genuine relationship with the larger world that most hobbits of his age had not felt the need to cultivate. He had read Bilbo's account, He had heard the stories. He had lived with the ring as a background presence in his home for 17 years without understanding what it was, and in that time it had done to him what it did to everyone who spent extended time near it, which was to make itself feel necessary, make itself feel like a natural feature of the landscape of daily life, rather than an object with history and agenda and the patient gravity of something always moving toward its maker. Let the warmth around you be conscious and specific, the temperature of the air, the weight of whatever covers you, the sound of the night outside, whatever that sound is, which is the sound of the ordinary world continuing its ordinary business without requiring anything of you. You are present in it without being burdened by it. Frodo, in this part of the story, is about to discover what being burdened by the world actually means. The contrast between his experience and yours tonight is one of the quieter comforts of listening to this kind of story in the dark. The Council of Elrond assembled in Rivendell to decide what to do with the ring, and the decision reached there is one of the most counterintuitive decisions in the history of Middle-earth, and also, from a certain angle, the only logical one. The ring could not be used by those who wished to use it for good, because the ring's power was the power of domination and control, and even the wisest and most powerful beings in the world, if they took the ring, would eventually become servants of the purpose it contained, rather than masters of a purpose they had chosen. Gandalf said no to it. Galadriel said no to it with a speech that described what she would become if she took it in terms that made the refusal obviously correct. The great could not wield it safely. The powerful would be corrupted by it. It had to be destroyed, and the only fire in the world capable of destroying it was the fire that had made it, and the one who was to carry it to the fire was the one who could not use it. Could not use it not because of weakness, but because of the specific quality of smallness that the ring had no angle of approach into. The hobbit's contented smallness that did not want to rule, and did not want to dominate, and did not have the ambitions that the ring could amplify into catastrophe. Frodo took the ring at the council not because he was the strongest or the wisest or the best prepared, but because in the moment when no one else spoke, he found that he could, that the word he was going to say was yes. The enormity of what he was agreeing to had resolved in him into a single clear willingness that was not courage in any heroic sense, but simply the absence of a better alternative, and the presence of enough love for the world to make that absence sufficient motivation. Sam went because Sam was always going to go. This is the simplest truth in the story and also the deepest one. Sam was Frodo's gardener and his friend and the person who understood, with a practical and completely unromantic clarity, that Frodo was going somewhere very dangerous and that Frodo was going to need someone there whose concern for Frodo's actual well-being was not subordinate to any other concern. Sam did not want adventure in any sense that involved the adventure being about him. He wanted Frodo to come home safely, and going along was the only way he could see to maximize the odds of that outcome. The ring never had any real purchase on Sam. He held it once, briefly, and felt its weight, and felt the faint whisper of the life it offered him, a garden he could make bloom like no garden in the world, and then gave it back, which was one of the most heroic things anyone did in the whole course of the quest. Bilbo saw Frodo before the Fellowship left Rivendell. He was old now, genuinely old. The years that the ring had held at bay rushing in after his departure from Bag End, turning him from the preserved middle-aged hobbit of the party to a very old creature very quickly. He gave Frodo the mithril coat, which was the most valuable thing he possessed, and the short sword Sting, which had been his companion on his own adventure, and he asked to see the ring once more, just to hold it, just to remember. Frodo, watching his old face in the moment of asking, saw something else in it, something that pulled him back and kept the ring on its chain, and the moment passed. Bilbo's face returned to old and kind and himself. He said, "Go carefully, my dear boy," and meant it with everything that remained of him. The journey that followed is the longest part of the story and the hardest part, and the part that most fully reveals what the ring is by showing what it cost to carry it. Frodo grew heavier as he went south and east, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with his pack, that was internal and specific and visible to Sam in the particular way that one person's suffering is visible to someone who loves them and is watching closely. The ring was working, not dramatically, not in the manner of obvious corruption, but in the patient way it always worked, the slow amplification of whatever was already present. In Frodo's case, The weight of responsibility and the awareness of how much was riding on his endurance, and the very specific loneliness of carrying something that no one else could carry for him. The road from the Shire to Mount Doom is the longest road in the Third Age's history in the sense that matters most, which is not its physical distance but its interior dimension, the distance that Frodo travelled inside himself between the person who set out from Bag End and the person who stood at the crack of doom. He did not travel that interior distance alone. Sam was there. Gollum was there in the strange manner that Gollum was anywhere, always on the edge of usefulness and betrayal simultaneously, serving despite himself the purpose that Bilbo's pity had prepared for him. The Fellowship came apart and came together in different configurations and was always, at its most essential, 2 hobbits from the Shire and a creature who had once been one, all 3 of them necessary for the ending that the ring's destruction required. There is a scene near the end of the journey that stays with everyone who hears it. Sam, after Frodo collapses on the slopes of Mount Doom, unable to go further, picks him up and carries him. "Come on, Mr. Frodo. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you." The distinction matters enormously, and Sam understood it precisely. The ring was Frodo's burden in a way that admitted of no substitution. The ring's weight was specific to its bearer and could not be transferred. But Frodo's physical weight, Frodo's exhausted body on the ash-covered slope that Sam could carry, and he did, up the mountain, the last distance, so that Frodo could stand at the edge of the fire where the ring needed to be. The answer was no, and it was also yes, and both answers were given at the same moment, and the world was saved not by a choice freely made, but by the convergence of a freely made mercy from 60 years before, and a consuming obsession that had never stopped consuming. Gollum took the ring. Gollum fell. The ring was destroyed, and 2 hobbits lay on the slope of a mountain and waited to be rescued from the consequence of having saved the world. This is where the story of the ring that found Bilbo in the dark ends, not with triumph exactly, but with the particular exhausted piece of something completed. Not won, completed. There is a difference, and it is important. Bilbo found the ring in a tunnel. He carried it home in his pocket. He kept it in his house for 60 years. He left it on the floor for Frodo. And all of that, the riddle game and the mercy and the 60 years and the envelope on the mantelpiece, were the first links in a chain that ran to the fire and the ending of an age. Let that chain of ordinary moments carry you toward rest now. The world is saved in the small things before it is saved in the great ones. Let your own small moments be enough tonight. They are. They always are. Rivendell held Frodo and the Fellowship for 2 months before the journey south began, and those 2 months were not rest in any simple sense. They were preparation, the kind of preparation that takes the form of decision-making and counsel, and the gradual understanding of what is actually at stake in what one is agreeing to. Frodo spent those months in the company of beings who had been alive for ages, who had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms and the making and unmaking of great works of power, and in their company he developed the specific humility of a person who has been shown the scale of the world he inhabits. Not the crushing humility that paralyzes action, but the useful kind, the kind that allows a person to understand clearly how large the problem is and still decide to be part of the solution. The Fellowship itself is one of the story's most carefully composed images, the 9 walkers matched against the 9 Nazgul, the representatives of the free peoples gathered in a configuration that included every kind of being capable of resistance. Gandalf the wizard, 4 hobbits, 2 men, an elf, a dwarf. Assembled not because they were the most powerful, but because they were the most available and the most willing, and because the particular combination of their qualities was, in ways that Elrond and Gandalf had considered carefully, appropriate to the task. The elf and the dwarf, who represented a friendship that had not been easy to achieve across their people's long history of misunderstanding, embodied in their presence the kind of alliance that the quest required. The man who would be king, walking incognito. The hobbit who carried the ring. The wizard who would fall and return. Every member of the Fellowship was exactly what they were, and what they were was what was needed. The Nazgul who pursued Frodo from the Shire to Rivendell were not simply Sauron's agents. They were the men who had taken the 9 rings 3,000 years before, the great kings and sorcerers and warriors who had accepted the gift of power, and lived long enough to have power become their prison. They had been men of Bilbo's general sort once, which is to say men, people with lives and histories and whatever they had valued enough to sell their essential selves for. The rings had given them exactly what they sought, and then continued to give it past the point of enjoyment into the point of torment, preserving them in a state that was neither fully alive nor fully dead, maintaining their existence across the ages as an expression of Sauron's will rather than their own. They were the most extreme version of what the ring did to everyone it touched for long enough. It kept them going, but it did not keep them living, and by the third age they had been not quite dying for so long that death, the complete and permanent version that Frodo and the others feared, would have been a mercy they could not receive. We have travelled a long road together tonight. From the fires of Orodruin at the close of the Second Age, through the cold river where the ring lay for centuries, through the dark tunnel under the mountain and the riddle game and the pocket, and the 60 years of an ordinary-seeming life in an extraordinary-seeming hole in the ground. From Bilbo's accidental finding to Frodo's deliberate carrying to the fire that unmaking required. We have followed the ring's journey, and we have followed the story of the small people through whom that journey passed, and we arrive now at the end of it with the particular quality of tiredness that long roads produce, the tiredness that is also satisfaction, the kind of exhaustion that comes from having gone somewhere real and come back changed. Let that quality be present in your body now. Let your limbs be heavy and your breathing slow, and the warmth around you be the specific warmth of the place where the journey ends, which is always, eventually home. The ring did not choose Bilbo in the way that people make choices. This point deserves revisiting one final time before we rest, because the relationship between the ring's apparent purpose and the random-seeming fact of a hobbit's hand moving across a tunnel floor is one of the most philosophically interesting aspects of the whole story. The ring was moving towards Sauron. That was its structural intention, the orientation encoded in its making. It had been moving in that direction for the entire Second Age and the first 2,000 years of the Third, passing from Isildur's grasp to the riverbed, and then through Gollum and then into the mountain where Gollum had taken it. Everything in its history up to the moment of Bilbo's finding was consistent with a movement toward Mordor, toward the growing shadow in the south and east, toward the power that had made it. And then a hobbit's hand moved across a stone floor in the dark. And the ring, which had no consciousness and no capacity for surprise, found itself in a pocket moving north and west rather than south and east, moving toward the Shire rather than toward Mordor, moving in exactly the wrong direction for its structural purpose and exactly the right direction for the world's survival. Whether this was luck or fate or the operation of something that the wisest minds in Middle-earth called by different names, without fully agreeing on its nature, it was the decisive moment. The ring's long journey toward its maker was interrupted by the most undramatic possible means. A small person in a dark tunnel reached down. Tolkien understood something about the relationship between the small and the large that runs through every level of the story. The hobbits are not chosen for their greatness. They are not chosen at all, in any sense that involves someone sitting down and selecting them from a list of candidates. They are present. They are available. They are in the places where the story needs someone to be present and available, and their smallness, which looks from the outside like irrelevance, is actually what makes them capable of carrying what the great cannot carry. The ring cannot find purchase in Frodo the way it finds purchase in Boromir, because Frodo does not want to rule. It cannot amplify in Sam what it amplifies in Gollum, because Sam's desires are fundamentally domestic, oriented toward a garden and a friend and a good meal. The hobbits are, in Tolkien's understanding, the people most able to carry the ring precisely because they are the people least interested in using it. This is worth sitting with. The quality that makes you seem irrelevant is sometimes the quality that makes you essential. The smallness that looks like it disqualifies you from the great work is sometimes exactly what the great work requires. Bilbo was not a hero by any standard definition when he ran out of Bag End without his handkerchief. He was a respectable hobbit having a moment of uncharacteristic impulsiveness. What he became over the course of the adventure, and what Frodo became over the course of his, and what Sam demonstrated he already was all along, was not a transformation into heroic greatness, but a revelation of a deeper kind of adequacy that does not announce itself in advance and cannot be confirmed until the moment that tests it. Bilbo lived out his remaining years in Rivendell, writing and resting and watching the elves with the affectionate attention of someone who had earned the right to watch them, who had done what was asked and more, and who had given away the thing that needed to be given away and had survived the giving. He finished there and back again. He added to it. He worked on translations from the Elvish that only he among the living hobbits had enough quenya to attempt. He ate well. He smoked his pipe. He told his stories to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear them, and in Rivendell there were beings who had lived long enough to appreciate a well-told story without impatience. He was, by the end, something that the Shire's original assessment of peculiar had not captured. He was complete. He went to the Grey Havens at the end of the Third Age, with Gandalf and Galadriel and the last of the elves departing Middle-earth. He went with Frodo, who was leaving behind wounds that would not heal in Middle-earth, and who was offered the grace of the Undying Lands as a recognition of what the Ring-bearers had suffered and endured. The Grey Havens are where this story ends, at least in its earthly register, and they have the quality that all genuine endings have, which is the quality of a door closing quietly and leaving behind a room that is both emptier and more itself than it was before. Middle-earth continued without them. Men came into their full inheritance of the world. The memory of what had happened became legend and then myth, and then the deep background of a world that went on being the world after the event that had made it safe to do so. Samwise Gamgee returned to the Shire and his garden and rose cotton, and in the fullness of long years went west in his own time, the last of the company, the last living link to what had happened on the slopes of Mount Doom, and in the tunnels of the Misty Mountains, and in all the long story of the Ring's journey through the hands that carried it. His last act, returning to the Shire and tending his garden and raising his family, was entirely consistent with the first act, which was refusing to let Frodo leave without someone to carry him when carrying became necessary. Sam began and ended as himself. This is, in the end, the highest thing the story says about any of its characters. The ones who remained themselves across everything that tried to change them are the ones the story honours most. The Ring teaches, across all its long history and all the hands it passed through, that the thing worth most is not the power to dominate, but the willingness to give away. Bilbo understood this eventually. It cost him 60 years and a moment of genuine difficulty in front of Gandalf, and the specific grief of setting down something that had felt for a long time like the most important part of him. What he found on the other side of setting it down was himself, restored, lighter than he had been in years, the long road from the mountain tunnel leading finally, after all its detours and delays, to a place of rest. That is the Ring's last teaching, delivered in the moment of its absence. You are not the things you carry. When you set them down, you are still there. Let your hands open now, softly, gently, in the dark. Let whatever you have been holding that needed holding be still. The night is warm and quiet and entirely ordinary in the best way that ordinary can mean. The Ring is unmade, the age has ended. The world that continues is the one that was saved by small people doing the quiet things that needed doing in the dark and in the light, and in all the unremarkable moments between. Your watch is ended for tonight. Sleep now, as deeply and as peacefully as the Shire sleeps, which is very deeply and very peacefully indeed, in the full knowledge that the fires are tended and the roads are quiet, and the morning, when it comes, will ask nothing of you that you cannot give. Sleep well. The story will be here when you wake. If you enjoyed this journey, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight and what time it is there. I love knowing where these stories find their listeners. And if there is a piece of Middle-earth lore or a chapter of history you would like to explore in the next story, leave that too. Rest now. Good night. The Fourth Age that began after the destruction of the Ring is a time that the old stories touch briefly and incompletely, as if the world they knew had become something so different that the conventions available to tell it were inadequate. Men came into their inheritance fully. The elves departed. The wizards completed their work and withdrew. The trees and the rivers and the hills remained, exactly as they had always been, holding in their long memories the record of everything that had happened in their presence across the uncountable years since the world was made. The world that the free peoples had fought to preserve continued to exist, continued to contain its portion of beauty, and its portion of sorrow, and its portion of the ordinary human endeavour of making lives in the presence of both. This is what had been saved, not perfection, the ongoing possibility of ordinary goodness. Tolkien wrote once that the story of the Ring was, at its deepest level, a story about mortality and the desire to escape it. Sauron wanted to dominate because domination is one of the strategies that consciousness uses against the knowledge that it is impermanent. The elves who made the Great Rings wanted to preserve because preservation is another strategy against the same knowledge. The hobbits, who accepted mortality with the equanimity of creatures who had not spent enough time thinking about it to become desperate about it, who built their lives around the pleasures of the present rather than the project of defeating time, were immune to the ring in the specific way that their relationship with impermanence protected them. What you're not afraid to lose cannot be used as leverage against you. The Shire's wisdom, the wisdom of the hearth and the garden and the 7 meals and the pipe and the fire in the evening, was the wisdom of people who had found a way to be at home in time rather than at war with it. The sense in which Bilbo chose the ring, even though the ring was working on him to ensure he kept it, is the sense in which every choice made under the influence of something larger than yourself is still a choice. The ring amplified and exploited and directed, but it could not originate. The love of the ring that Bilbo felt was built on something that was already in him, some genuine attachment to the beautiful and the secret, and the particular pleasure of having something that was entirely one's own. The ring made that attachment into something it could use, but it was real to begin with. This is the most uncomfortable truth the ring teaches about the nature of temptation. The tempting thing does not create the desire it exploits. It finds the desire where it already lives and makes it stronger, which means that understanding what you are vulnerable to, looking honestly at what you love and what you fear losing, is not a counsel of despair, but a counsel of awareness. What you can see clearly, you can eventually choose to set on the floor and walk away from. Samwise Gamgee's return to the Shire after the War of the Ring is the story's last act of restoration, the rebuilding of what the ring and the scouring had damaged, conducted by someone who understood what the Shire was worth precisely because he had spent a year and a half in the presence of everything that threatened it. He planted a tree in the party field where Saruman's malice had removed the old one. He planted seeds from the lady's gift across the Shire, and the following spring was the finest the hobbits had seen in living memory. He did these things not because he was performing a symbolic act of renewal, but because he was a gardener, and gardens needed planting and the Shire needed its trees. The symbolism was in the act itself, not in Sam's intention, which was as practical and specific as it had always been. This is what the story says about restoration. It is not performed, it is done.